Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Global Economic Challenge Network and our co-sponsors, the Knight Georgetown Institute, the Communications, Culture and Technology Program, the Centre for Digital Ethics and Tech and Public Policy Program, it's a great pleasure to invite you all here today on this event. The Georgetown Global Economic Challenge Network, as you can tell by its name, typically works on issues to do with economics. But more recently, President DeJoy and I had a conversation, and he said to me, wouldn't it be great if we had some events related to democracy? I have to admit, the minute he said that, the first person who came into my mind was Nate. Here we are. So we've got the event this week. I would like to bring to people's attention, there's another event which is equally exciting next week on trust in public elections. And that'll be next Tuesday at 5 o'clock. So with that, look, because we've got such a terrific panel, I don't want to take up too much time. So I'm just going to say very quickly, I'd like to thank all the participants. I'd like to thank Nate, who was particularly active in organising some aspects of the event. I'd like to thank Letitia, who also was very active, in fact led the guidance for the preparation for the event. I'd like to thank Tom Banchoff's Office of Global Engagement, and in particular Mary Gordon and Julia Murillo, who I've been working with them for 4 years, and they're outside so they can't hear this, but I'm sure every time they see an email message from me, their blood pressure goes up a couple of points. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. So with that, I'd like to introduce Letitia Bodie, who's going to be the moderator. She is the professor in communication and technology and the research director for the Knight Georgetown Institute. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Frank. And big thanks go to you for putting this all together and reaching out of your comfort zone to figure out what this event should look like. And I will second Frank's thanks to all of the co-sponsors and the Office of the President and to Maria and Julia for all of their help. I'm going to kick things off to talk a little bit about why we're here today and then briefly introduce all of our amazing panelists, and we'll spend most of the time hearing what they have to say about this important topic. So as you may know, 2024 is what some call the World Cup of elections. We have a global record for the number of people that are voting this year. It's kind of a huge win for democracy from one perspective. 4 billion people across the globe from more than 40 countries go to the polls this year to elect their nation-state leaders, and that's more than half of the world's population. So it's a big year. At the same time, we are learning about new capabilities in artificial intelligence, and I'm going to give one very brief explanation of what artificial intelligence is, and our esteemed panelists can offer all of the changes that they want to make to that definition accordingly. But what we're talking about here is the ability of computers to perform tasks that are usually something only humans could do, right? So things like visual perception, speech recognition, decision-making, language translation, things that used to be really hard for machines to do. Increasingly, these are capabilities that are well within the range of things that machines can do. And much of the hype when we're talking about AI is around generative AI, which is the ability of these machines to offer human-sounding responses to human-generated prompts. And I think the real question here is how these multiple intersecting technological innovations are intersecting with this power play of democracy that's happening this year, and not just the elections that are happening, but democratic norms and processes more broadly. And we have a panel of 4 world-renowned experts on this topic. You're really lucky to be here today or be joining us online, that I will briefly introduce, and then they'll give some opening thoughts on this topic. To my left is Laura DeNardis, who's the professor and endowed chair of Technology, Ethics, and Society at Georgetown. She also directs the Center for Digital Ethics, which, as you heard, is the co-sponsor of the event. She's published 7 books, including the most recent, The Internet in Everything, and broadly studies the societal implications of digital technologies. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Tim Harper is the Senior Policy Analyst for Democracy and Elections at the Center for Democracy and Technology here in DC. He leads the organization's efforts to fight election disinformation, support technology that bolsters a fair and secure vote, and build trust in elections. So also relevant to the event next week. Tim has 11 years of experience working in election policy at places like Meta, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Janet Haven is the executive director at Data and Society, and she's worked at the intersection of technology, policy, governance, and accountability for more than 20 years, including at the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee as an expert for the UN Security General's high-level advisory body on AI. It's a lot of words. As a member of the Partnership on AI's Philanthropy Steering Committee and the Open Society Foundation, and a variety of technology startups in Central Europe. And finally, Nate Persily is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford, with appointments in departments of political science, communication, and international studies. It's like Pokemon, you gotta collect them all, I think. He's also the founding co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and its program on democracy and the internet, and the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. He's also served as commissioner on the Kofi Annan Commission on Elections and Democracy in the Digital Age, the senior research director for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, and as a court-appointed expert to craft redistricting plans for 7 different US states. So I think I have now convinced you that these people know what they're talking about. So let's hear what they have to say about AI and democracy. Laura, can you kick it off for us?
Yes, thank you very much, and hi everyone. It's really good to be here and to join my panelists, and look forward to the discussion with the audience as well. I want to start with just 2 stories from the past week that are a reminder that a discussion about AI and democracy is not a theoretical discussion, but really a real-world flashpoint. I'm not going to belabor these because you've probably heard about them, but one incident involves claims about Russian actors actively seeking to manipulate public opinion ahead of the upcoming election in the United States. So the Department of Justice charged 2 employees of the Russian media network, RT, with some very technical legal-sounding things like the Foreign Agents Registration Act, money laundering. But what really was this about? What they were doing is allegedly using a US company to circulate information to influencers who then circulated the information, to amplify it. Some of this information generated by AI. Now I want you to just keep in the back of your mind for a moment that in addition to this story, the DOJ also seized 32, I believe, domain names. So just keep that in mind for a second. Another uncovered Russian influence campaign called Doppelganger used generative AI to create deceptive content and place this content on websites that had domain names or URLs. Like when you see Georgetown.edu, that's an example of a URL for a website, a domain name. They place them on domain names with typos, essentially. We used to call this in the 1990s domain name cyber squatting, but that's still done today. And so instead of nato.int, you'd have nato.ws. So with these incidents as a backdrop, I just thought I would start by making 3 quick points. The first point about AI and democracy is that while all of us should be skeptical, we should have discernment, we should have digital literacy, we should be aware of things happening at the content level, actually, AI democracy entanglements are about far more than the content. This is because AI is not one thing. It's an incredibly diverse area, and as an engineer who studies this and a social scientist, I look at the layers of technology, and this is just like many other areas of technology. It's complex, it's diverse. It involves the chip layer, the infrastructure underneath the chip layer, the collection systems, drones, satellites, autonomous agents, and in some domains that includes weapon systems, not in the information sphere, but you can define some of what happened as weapons. There's the machine learning, large language model layer, communication systems, the technical standards on which all of this is based. There's cloud computing that houses it all. I could go on and on and on. And of course, complex cybersecurity systems and the data itself. So the key takeaway there is that AI is not one thing. Therefore, AI governance and the entanglements with democracy are not one thing or one problem. And most of the most difficult problems are actually far beneath the layer of content. So understanding this complexity is really important to understand points of intervention, not just the points of the problem. So in this case, the case that I mentioned of malign Russian attempted interference, it involved the turn to infrastructure, meaning the domain name system, and I see some of my global cyber policy students here, you know what that is, to redirect, to take down, instead of taking the content down itself, you could use infrastructure control points to tackle some of these problems. So there is a problem, though, in domestic discussions, and also a problem in international summits, from the G7 to the AI Safety Summit, in that there's a myopic focus on generative AI and content generally. So that's a point. The first point I want to make is just that it would be far more damaging to democracy to use AI to disrupt something a little bit deeper in the infrastructure, like cybersecurity or critical infrastructure systems, than disrupting the content. That leads directly to a quick second point, and that is that cybersecurity and AI really have to converge strongly in order to protect democracy. And it's not happening. AI is, of course, already the basis of many cybersecurity techniques, such as pattern recognition and looking for DDoS attacks, fraud detection. Some of you have probably traveled abroad and gotten some kind of a notification from your credit card saying, we think there's been fraud. It may just be you traveling, but you've experienced that. A lot of that is done by AI. So this is already part of the system, but there's also a tension between those kinds of cyber defenses and cyber offense. And if you think about the stakes of AI around democracy and also other important public interest areas, I think the needle has to move more towards cyber defense than cyber offense. Now, why is there that tension? Because in technology policy, you expect law enforcement, and you expect intelligence systems, and you expect different kinds of entities designed to protect people to be able to read information, access information, to conduct cyber offensive operations, but you also need them to provide cyber defense. And so I just raise that as a question. It seems like the needle has to move a little bit more. I also wanted to make one positive statement, if I may. And that's that AI has very positive effects for democracy. And the story that I started with is obviously a problematic story, but it's critical to acknowledge the ways that AI is at the core of so many things that are happening in society that are helpful to democracy. Of course, we have great medical colleagues here on campus who are applying AI to healthcare innovations and to medical discovery. In my own area of cybersecurity, it's very, very helpful. We need AI to defend our infrastructures and to shore up the systems of democracy. So that's my opinion. I think it's very important for democracy, but yet we have a dystopian view of generative AI across all quarters. Everywhere I go, there's a dystopian view. And I jotted down a few quotes here. I don't think I'll read them, but think about Italy initially banning generative AI. Bill Gates is existentially concerned. Even Sam Altman described it as both awesome and terrifying. Thinkers ranging from Elon Musk to Stephen Hawking have been concerned about whether this is a catastrophic event for humanity to have these advanced technologies. So you have to pay attention when you hear those concerns. But there is another side to this, and that's AI is also necessary for a flourishing democracy, for economic competition, to keep up geopolitically across the world, including in emerging markets. So I'll just end with that positive statement and really look forward to hearing my other co-panelists and what they have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Tim, you're good.
All right, great. That makes it so much easier. Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to start by kind of setting some context for the conversation and then kind of get into some points about what I think some of the major risks from generative AI specifically are. We've talked about a kind of broad scope of the layers of AI and all the different ways in which it comes in and what's involved with that technology, but I think I'll kind of focus mostly on the generative AI side of things. The first is just kind of set some context. As Letitia said at the beginning, this is the largest single year of global elections since the advent of the internet. More than half the world's population across 80 different countries will go to the polls this year. The ways in which that plays out is still being determined. And what I think is important is that there's a lot of context for how this election cycle, 2024, is unique from other elections we've seen in recent years. For instance, there are a number of ways in which context has changed. So many online platforms that have achieved very large status have inadequate platform readiness. We've seen things like layoffs take place across the industry in the United States and abroad, which has taken out a lot of people that worked in trust and safety fields. I myself used to work at Meta before my political ads team was incorporated into a broader team, and many of the folks there were moved into other roles. Second is that in addition to many of the companies having kind of fewer folks working on these areas, and they are increasingly prioritizing using ML to conduct content moderation of their platforms, there also is kind of larger problems going on across the industry, like things like, for instance, a balkanization of the information environment because of new platforms. Places like Twitch are increasingly becoming places where major conversations about politics happen that didn't exist during the 2020 election, or if they didn't have a major role like they do today. That also was accompanied by kind of alternative social media platforms like Truth Social and Gab and others that are further balkanizing the information environment, so that the kind of bubbles that we already saw with social media are becoming even more pronounced, right? Another is that over the last 4 years, we've also seen emergence of new partisan court cases and investigations by members of Congress, things like the Murphy versus Missouri case, which, although it ruled that there wasn't illegal job owning going on where the government was encouraging or illegally encouraging platforms to remove moderated content, there was kind of an impact on the government's ability to share intelligence with social media platforms that many platforms already are continuing to say those intelligence sharing networks have not recovered since. Finally, those kind of investigations and partisan cases have also resulted in stifling independent election misinformation and disinformation research. So we've seen that's resulted in, for instance, the Stanford Internet Observatory being shuttered because of ongoing legal challenges from those investigations. Now, those are kind of some of the context setting for this year that I think make this election unique. Obviously, there also has been the emergence of majorly publicly available LLM platforms, including ChatGPT and others that have emerged in the last 4 years that make this a unique election cycle. Now, when we talk about generative AI and kind of its risk for elections, I think it's important to ground it in a few different ways in which that can actually play out. And what we're looking at this year are a few different things. At CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology, where I work, we're looking at a few different things that I want to highlight. The first is that generative AI can be used to kind of boost the ability to hyper-target mis- or disinformation at a hyper-local level. So take, for example, someone taking a publicly available data set of people's phone numbers and matching that with a data set of where voter precincts are and what locations they are around the country, and then using generative AI at scale to distribute text messages to people that could say something like, FYI, voting at Peace Auditorium is paused because of fire sprinklers. That might be much more persuasive than most people would expect disinformation to be, because there's a truth signal that they know that their precinct is Peace Auditorium. Another way is through through language minority influence. So a traditional limitation of disinformation campaigns is that it's extremely expensive and time-consuming to translate your disinformation campaign into foreign languages in a persuasive way that is believable to the viewer. But generative AI tools are extremely capable of doing this. And so that lowers the barrier and the cost to target much more specific communities. So imagine Spanish language speakers in southern Florida, or Arabic speakers in eastern Michigan, or Navajo speakers in Arizona. There is the ability to influence very important communities in swing states that might be a new factor this year. The third is that those are kind of both disinformation focuses. Another is misinformation. What we know is that chatbots themselves are not very good at avoiding providing misinformation for voters. There's been a number of surveys that have found that, for instance, most recently, Amazon Alexa was giving incorrect information or biased information about Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. We've seen a number of studies that have confirmed that, for instance, the Copilot from Microsoft had something like 38% of all of its answers were inaccurate when it was giving information about voting in France and Germany. There have been a number of studies by the AI democracy projects and Proof News that have also confirmed a vast amount of misinformation being spread through either hallucination of completely artificial information or fake or false information on those chatbots. I will peep that CDT will be releasing a report next week in which we conducted a study of 5 major chatbot platforms in which we found that there was a significant amount of misinformation, either incorrect information or straight hallucinations, targeting voters with disabilities. When you ask questions specifically, if you are a person with disabilities, about how to vote, much of that information was inaccurate. Finally, is that in addition to kind of dis and misinformation, there's also a risk of cybersecurity being implicated from generative AI. So some of the ways in which this could affect election officials themselves is that it could make targeting attacks for phishing much more persuasive. It could result in allowing people to alter their voice to target them with harassment. It makes doxing easier. You can automate FOIA requests that could overwhelm an elections office. You could dupe an elections website by creating fake results on a website that looks believably like an elections website in order to convince people that an election was rigged or has a faulty result. There are a number of ways in which across the cybersecurity space that these tools could and may be used to influence elections and their outcomes. All of this is not even mentioning the fact that deepfakes could also be used to influence the outcome of elections by either copying a candidate saying something that they did not say, as we saw in Slovakia earlier late last year, where a candidate was deepfaked to be saying that he had manipulated the outcome of the election when that was not the case. I will stop there. There are a number of other risks that I think are prominent, but I'm sure that we will get into them throughout this conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Tim. Go ahead, Jana.
Sure, thank you. Well, so I think the bad news, where I would like to start, and I think largely what I'm going to talk about, is that we do not yet have very robust ways to govern these technologies. So the issues that my colleagues have brought up in their talks are particularly worrying because we really don't have a set of laws in the United States that would protect all of us from these harms. And yet, we have a lot of AI out in the world. So this is a problem. And it's something, I think, the good news is that we are learning how to govern technology, but I think we have a really long way to go. And I would argue that ungoverned AI systems and more broadly data-centric technologies are eroding democratic norms and protections and practice. The history on this, at least in the United States, is that we've been pretty bad at governing technology. We have been pretty good at holding public hearings and congressional commissions and inviting tech CEOs to come and defend themselves. But when it comes to actually passing laws that would protect Americans and others outside the United States, we really haven't done that. And so what I would say we need to be thinking about is how do we build governance for these systems that focus not only on technical means, which are important, but also on fundamental rights-based protections, on ensuring access to opportunity for everyone, on protection from fraud and deceptive practices, which we're increasingly seeing as an issue. And at Data and Society, which is the organization that I run, we study data-centric technologies. We study the societal impact of those technologies. And one of the things that we argue through our work is that governance needs to be grounded in the real life experiences of people who are using these technologies. That we really need to understand the ways in which technologies exist in the real world and interact with all kinds of systems that are around us, with human labor, with organizational bureaucracy, with power and power differentials within a community. And all of those things we need to really understand in order to be able to design governance systems that are meaningful and that really get to the kinds of protections that we need. So I'm going to dive into the question of democracy and AI a little bit deeper. I think that the public focus and I think also some of the conversation on the panel has been on mis and disinformation, on electoral integrity as a democracy issue. We've also heard a lot about biased algorithms leading to discriminatory outcomes. And those are both very, very critical issues that deserve governance attention that I think we're going to be talking more about over the course of this discussion. But I think we also need to be concerned with the ways in which the lack of governance of data-centric technologies, including artificial intelligence, has allowed profound power imbalances to be entrenched in our society. The concentration of power in the private sector really cannot be addressed with technical fixes. We need structural governance of the type that, for instance, was laid out in the Biden administration's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which came out in October of 2022. And this is one of the first, I think, really powerful and attempts to be comprehensive in an approach to thinking about how we govern AI. And it really grounded the idea of rights protections, of protecting data privacy, of ensuring freedom from algorithmic discrimination, of ensuring that there is a human in the loop when you encounter an AI system, of mandating disclosure of systems, transparency of how those systems work, and accountability for harms that may occur when people use those systems. Similarly, the executive order on AI that the Biden administration put out a year later at the end of 2023 used the frame of rights and safety as an approach to governing artificial intelligence. And I think both of those are very grounding and are, I think, a really powerful way to approach how we think about designing governance systems. And that is contested. So that's something that we really need to pay attention to the framing of governance, because it isn't inevitable that we come to the position of protecting rights and ensuring safety and ensuring opportunity. The concentration of power and the lack of public oversight of technologies impact democratic norms and practices. And I want to just hit on 3 ways. There are a lot of ways, as my colleagues have talked about, but I want to hit on 3 ways that we're seeing that happen. So one is on the distorting effects of governance itself. The question of who is defining the problems that we are trying to solve is very significant. And right now, a lot of that definition is coming from private industry. It's not coming from all of you. It's not coming from a public interest group. It is coming from the private sector. And then the question of how we solve those problems is also at issue. Whether we solve those problems with purely technical fixes, whether we have a focus on long-term existential harms to the exclusion of current known harms like algorithmic discrimination and violations of data privacy. Those are all contested issues in how we actually define the problem of governance. Second, we see a real impact on work and on workers. The sort of core issue that I think has been visible around work and workers when it comes to AI is job loss, which is, of course, going to be a significant issue. I think there's still a lot of research happening on the extent to which we'll see significant job loss because of artificial intelligence. But what isn't contested is that we are seeing increasing amounts of worker surveillance in the workplace, and using the data that is collected from workers, we're seeing increasing algorithmic management, close control through algorithmic systems of workers and what they do with every minute of their working day. And so this really impacts the ability of workers to do things like organize, like build countervailing power. And it also impacts things that may seem softer, how workers have agency and a role, how to ensure job quality and job dignity. The last thing I want to mention that is significant because of that concentration of power I mentioned is the lack of investment in public options for AI. And what that means is that we are seeing a foreclosing of innovation and the development of new technologies in the public interest. So the technologies that we are getting are the ones that companies are building because they are going to turn the greatest profit. They will sell ads. They will allow companies to collect vast amounts of data. Hopefully, they will also create products that people want. But there is an underlying set of concerns that is driving those. And that means that there is much less investment in public solutions for technology to pressing societal challenges. And that really comes back to that concern that I raised about the concentration of data, of compute, of money, and of talent in the private sector. So I will leave it there.
Great, thanks so much, Janet. Take it away, Nate.
Thank you. I'm going to amplify some of the comments that have been made and then try to take them in a little bit of a different direction. I'll say that AI accentuates the abilities of all good and bad actors in the system to achieve the same goals that they've always had, all right? That's true if you are a foreign intelligence agency that's trying to disrupt another country's elections and you have previously been limited by the number of English language speakers, let's say, that you had in your employ. AI will facilitate that disruption of an election. It's also true that if you are a challenger to an incumbent and you have been cash-strapped in, for example, trying to develop ads for your candidate or to hire volunteers or to do phone banking, AI is going to make it cheaper for you to run that challenging campaign against the incumbent. If you're an election official who wants to optimize polling place allocation, or if you want to do voter outreach, or if you want to detect anomalies in the system, whether it's vote fraud or something else, AI is going to facilitate that as well. And so AI is on all of the apps in the phone right now that you have in your pocket. And so to think about, in some ways, you know, the scope of the AI and democracy problem, it's just a giant question because any interaction that we have with the digital sphere is now an interaction with AI in one sense or another. And so I think Letitia did us a favor by starting out and saying, well, in some sense, what is AI and what is democracy? What is it that we're trying to think about here? Because it could encapsulate all of these different questions. because AI right now is essentially the entire digital ecosystem in some way or another, though we focus for the most part, and I will, on generative AI. And then what is a democracy problem? And I think we've heard very different sort of vantage points on that. So on the one hand, and I'll spend a lot of time talking about, I think, the typical democracy problems and election problems that we attribute to technology. But look, if there's a cybersecurity intrusion that takes down the electrical grid on election day, right, that is a democracy problem, right? If we have massive job losses that affect the health of our democracy, lead to social unrest, that is a democracy problem. And so I'm going to focus on the sort of typical way that we think about AI and democracy, which is to say generative AI and elections. But I don't want to suggest that that kind of anemic framing is necessarily the extent of it, but I think that's where people would focus. And I would start by pointing out that a majority of Americans in recent polls are afraid that AI is going to determine the outcome of the 2024 election. Now, they've actually thought this for almost a year and a half, even before people started using AI in one way or another, right? But people are afraid of technology right now, and they're not so happy about the state of our democracy. And so when you put those two things together, you have this kind of perfect storm of fear and dysfunction. What I want to convey to you today is that we are caged by the 2016 election in the way that we are thinking about technology and democracy. The experience in 2016 with Russian disinformation incursions into Facebook and other platforms, as well as the problems with, say, Cambridge Analytica, has now sort of calcified in our minds a certain set of fears with respect to technology and democracy. Not unfounded fears, mind you, but that's like the perspective that we tend to take in thinking about the AI or the technology and democracy problem. And my comments are going to sort of be limited to try to convince you that that is a sort of both too narrow and too broad way of thinking about the AI and democracy problem. That social media and AI are different things, though they interact for reasons that were said before on this panel, but that we need to think about the AI and democracy problem in a slightly different way. Now, it's in some ways obvious why we would think that the same problems with respect to social media are going to be the AI democracy problem, because AI has a disinformation problem. It has a bias problem. It has an antitrust competition problem. It has a privacy and surveillance problem. But they are different in kind, and I'll try to suggest why that is. So let me start with the disinformation problem with respect to AI. It is true that now AI enables you to create all kinds of fake content, and you've seen you could see thousands of examples of this online, of fake pictures of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. In fact, there is still, it's now aged, there is a Twitch stream with a 24-hour-a-day debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump right now, where you can throw in questions and they will come up with creative and usually not safe for work answers. And so that this is running 24 hours a day of these avatars of Biden and Trump. So the amount of AI-generated content out there is massive, right? But that's in some ways not terribly interesting, right? That there's a lot of, whether it's disinformation or AI-generated content. The real question is, what's the probability that a large number of people who are swayable are going to receive some of that content? And we also need to recognize that AI panic is its own democracy problem, all right? That however much AI content might be out there, the average person is going to receive a tiny share of their feed being AI-generated content, all right? Like whether it's deep fakes or things like that. To be honest, for most people, say of their social media feeds, a very small share is actually anything that we would call politics or journalism or things that are sort of in those categories. An even smaller share would be disinformation, and then of that disinformation, a tiny share is going to be AI-generated. The problem is the panic that is caused from the specter of massive amounts of deep fake and artificial imagery then infects our trust on the remaining 99.9% of the content in our feeds. And if you had to think of like what is really the democracy problem here, it's not so much that you're going to be persuaded by the fake stuff, it's that you're going to lose confidence in the true stuff. And one of the things that we as disinformation researchers have learned over the last decade is that people are actually getting a little bit better at discerning what is false. They are getting worse at discerning what is true. And AI kind of hypercharges that phenomenon so that the concerns of the ubiquity of AI are then going to infect people's processing of most of the information that they confront, most of which is not false. Second, let me talk about AI bias. And I might have a kind of minority view on this, but I actually think AI bias is a conceptually impossible problem to solve, okay? Not that it's a technically impossible problem to solve, but that it's actually conceptually what we want the problem that we want to solve is actually a very difficult problem. Let me be clear, AI systems are all biased, and we see it in the criminal justice system with respect to bail, we see it in prosecution, the use by judges, the racial bias in employment use of AI. So it's clear that there is significant bias. You see it in the early, say, image generation tools, where you ask the image generation tools, draw me a picture of a nurse, and it was always coming up with a woman, for example. But what is the right answer? Say, take the image generation question as an example. What should the image generation tools do? Maybe, so take in the United States, where 80% of nurses happen to be women. Does that mean 4 out of 5 times when you ask a question about draw a picture of a nurse that they should come up with a woman? Leave aside for the moment how to express gender, which adds a big curveball into this. That's a reasonable approach, say 4 out of 5 times. But why that? Maybe one of the things that AI should be doing is correcting the patterns of societal bias and injustice that have perpetuated these inequities, right? So maybe it should be 50-50, it should flip a coin. All of these responses, and by the way, you see how the platforms have tried to deal with this, with the controversy related to Gemini and how it depicted, female popes and German soldiers in World War II of different races, right? That there's no value-neutral way to deal with the problem of AI bias. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to deal with this problem, as I was suggesting before, because it causes societal harm. But we need to decide, right, as a polity, what it is we want AI to do, right? And it's not just about sort of remedying, bias in the way that we have, as those of us who are like anti-discrimination lawyers have historically done. It's a conceptually difficult question as to how we're going to remedy these problems. And I think that AI bias is really at the top of the list as we think about some of the problems that a lot of the governments have been dealing with on how to make sure that AI doesn't lead to, say, discriminatory outcomes in employment, criminal justice, et cetera. Third point I want to talk about is competition. And I'm glad that you brought this up. And I think it is a really knotty problem. One of the things that makes AI different than social media is the availability of open source alternatives. And the open source question when it comes to AI is not like some sideshow question. It is like, in my opinion, like the mega, or in this case, the meta question that we have to deal with. So just to be clear, right, so Meta's model, Llama, is open source for the most part. And when we say open source, it's not really technically open source, it's models with open weights, but bracket that for a second, but I just, so the engineers in the audience don't take me out of it. It's all right, so it's often called open models. As well as other models around the world, Mistral in France for the most part, Falcon in the UAE, and others. There are over 60,000 now variations on open models on Hugging Face that have been developed. This is not, like I said, a small thing. On the one hand, you could say, look, this is democratic AI, right? This is pushing down to the masses the ability to edit and develop these LLMs so that then they could be distributed and tailor-made for various people, right? And especially if we start going toward the AGI, right, artificial general intelligence, right, you can think about, oh my gosh, that could be open source and available to everyone. But if you identify, in the first year and a half since the advent of ChatGPT, if you had to identify one social harm that was concrete and specific, it's the rise of the explosion of child pornography that we've seen through the creation of these open models. So Stability.com made its image model open source, or openly available. That led to the creation of unstable diffusion, which then led to this explosion of child pornography. That is, we will never live in a world without an infinite amount of child pornography. That you cannot put the toothpaste back in the tube after that. And that is the truth with all of sort of the phenomenon of open source. Once it's out in the wild, then you're not going to be able to claw it back. And so we, as a democracy, have to decide to what extent are we going to have an AI future which is dominated by a few oligopolistic companies, comparable to what we've seen in the social media sphere, or is it going to be a more open ecosystem in which we allow people the power to then tailor-make these kinds of systems for their own uses, with the acknowledged risks that some of these people who are going to be taking advantage of that new power are going to use it toward destructive and maybe socially dangerous ends. So that makes the regulatory challenge, and I'm going to close just by talking about regulation, very difficult. There's certain sort of low-hanging fruit that we could do, and states are doing this, federal government may do some of this, so things like disclosure requirements for the use of AI in political ads, right? At a certain stage, everything is going to, all ads are going to have some AI in it, but maybe we would be able to figure out a way around that. Liability for, among individuals for the misuse of AI. So think about those lawyers who were using ChatGPT and they made up sites, in their briefs, right? So there's some easy things that we could do there. But as you said earlier, most of the innovation that's happening with respect to AI is now locked up in the few companies that can afford to build the infrastructure. Unless we have a massive public investment in public infrastructure for the development of compute power and actually energy power also, so that those on the, say, in academia can do the innovating here, we are going to continually be at the mercy of the large companies that are developing these models, which itself, I think, is a democracy problem. But beyond just the public infrastructure that needs to be developed, we can write all the laws you want. We do not have the expertise in government, and no government does, to enforce any AI act that any of us would develop. We're going to have, let's say at Stanford this year, easily 1,000 students who are AI experts who graduate as undergrads. Very few of them, though we try in the Cyber Policy Center to direct them to this avenue, very few of them are going to work in government. Most of them are going to go down the street and make, gobs of money at the Silicon Valley firms. The AI Safety Institute in the United States has 15 people in it, okay? The British one, which is actually in some ways the most impressive, has like 150, which is quite impressive. The EU one is still getting off the ground. No matter how many of these people that we hire, and the executive order says every department in the US government has to have its like AI expert. We will not have the government capacity that is necessary in order to tackle what is a technology that is going to be ubiquitous throughout our lives. And so then what is to be done, and what is to be done now, because we don't have much time, right? The pace of development is so fast that we need to develop some way of checking the development of these models in the short term. And I should say, we in the US are particularly hamstrung because we don't have the kind of nimbleness that the Europeans have in their ability to change the laws and to have sort of greater enforcement and sort of a dialogic relationship between the government and the companies that are doing it. And by the way, I'll say like the European AI Act, which I think is a heroic achievement in so many ways, cannot mean what it says. It's like one of these laws that if you take it on its terms will probably lead to the shutting down of most of the AI firms. But it's not going to mean what it says. There's going to be a lot of sort of iteration back and forth between the companies and the government. And we in the US, we can't give that kind of broad authority to public agencies for various reasons, constitutional and otherwise, that in the Supreme Court has been pretty restrictive. And so now let me end on a rallying cry, which is about auditing, right? It's like, is there anything more passionate one can be about it, if not auditors? And we need to figure out a way to develop a robust private auditing mechanism for these companies, to develop a market for outside auditors, akin to what we see in the financial industry, that will provide for checks on these companies so that we have some system in place at the pre-deployment stage so that you get some testing that is done by a kind of Coopers and Lybrand or Moody's kind of institution. Of course, in the financial system, there's plenty of examples of them screwing up and being captured, and we need to avoid all of that, right? But we don't have the capacity in government right now, and I don't see it in the short term when we really need it in order to regulate this problem. And so we need to be as innovative in our regulatory solutions as the technology is in creating the problems.
Great, thank you. So I have to start by apologizing to all of our panelists that I am completely throwing out all the questions we had talked about before, because I have new ideas that I want to talk about instead. So I want to start by a couple of years ago when we hired Laura at Georgetown. She gave a job talk where she said that sometimes she just throws out things she calls provocations to her students to see how they will react to those things. And I hear students laughing in the room, so this resonates with them. She threw out a provocation here that I would like the other panelists to react to, if you will, which is that AI is necessary for a flourishing democracy. I don't know if you meant that as a provocation, but I'm just interpreting it that way. So I would love for you guys to react to that statement. Is AI necessary for a flourishing democracy? Yes, you can certainly elaborate.
I'll elaborate. I had one, just really quickly, I had one cousin who ran for Congress and won. I had another cousin who ran for Congress and lost. And the first one had a big war chest. The other one was, her opponent had 10 times the funding, and yet she won 49% of the vote. Could AI have moved the needle on that? The idea is that artificial intelligence, in the same way that it's creating greater productivity and efficiencies in something like healthcare, could have helped my cousin by creating press releases, by generating content, by providing the tools that you normally need a big war chest to do. I mean, that's a positive aspect of it. Voter turnout. Could AI be used to identify who to target to try to garner enthusiasm and turn out the vote? The answer is yes. Could AI be used from a data science perspective to analyze polling and bring those kinds of tools to people who don't usually have the money to do that? It can democratize electoral politics in a way that other technologies could also. And finally, and I'm sure my students have other answers to this, but one other area is, and I'll just ask this as a question, would there be as much enthusiasm about Kamala Harris immediately after when Biden kind of passed the mantle, if not for the generative AI memes that were out there and people got really excited about it, and there's a voter enthusiasm potential there because of the tools from a data analysis standpoint, from just productivity in electoral politics, and also in voter enthusiasm. So just a few provocations. And I agree with all of the concerns. I have those concerns. The same exact technologies that create concerns for democracy also create opportunities for the democratization.
Other thoughts?
I guess I'll keep mine brief. First, I mean, whether it's necessary, I think, is beside the point that it's inevitable. I don't think there's a world in which this technology is put back in a box and we just move on as though it doesn't already exist. That said, not to disagree with the point, I think there are ways in which it facilitates a flourishing democracy, but I would be remiss to say that it doesn't have risks. As Nate mentioned, there are both good and bad uses of every use case of this technology. We've seen maybe with the exemption of the use case of creating a technology that can clone people's voices. I don't think that there is a productive, I don't think there is a use case that was not intended for criminal use when it comes to that particular technology. That said, yeah, I mean, it can do things like, look, every time there's been a new technological development, there is a period of boom in which it destabilizes an existing democracy or any other system in which it's introduced into, right? Whether that is creating layoffs in a market where certain roles can be digitized or turned into AI assistants, right? Or whether or not it is in the context of in democracy, anytime a new technology emerges, there's also a way in which it'll be used both for good and ill, right? The Arab Spring is an example of like when social media became widely distributed across the world, there were new venues for people getting their voices heard and communicating with other people, which resulted in both the Arab Spring, but then also new government attempts to surveil and crack down against dissidents, right? So there is usually a good and a bad shift anytime new technology emerges and it is used by politics, right? So I think that that part of it can't be overstated as well. But I will reserve the rest of my thoughts for later.
So I think there's a long history of hopefulness about new technologies, bringing about a better future, and whether that is a better democracy or more equity or solving poverty. This is something that has been part of a long cycle of hope for technology. And so I guess what I would say is I would go back to something I said earlier, which is that technologies exist in the context in which they are used. And so I think to Nate's point that AI sort of turns up the volume, no matter what it is somebody is trying to do, I think that, if AI were to be used in a flourishing democracy, that it could be used in ways that would cause that democracy to flourish more, perhaps. But I think that the idea that AI would bring about a flourishing democracy is one that I would deeply disagree with.
So why don't I make a pitch for voice cloning? Which is to say, like all of these things, I can give you a good use case for voice cloning. In fact, I used it myself. So I was able to give a speech in Singapore in Chinese, Malay, and Tamil because I was able to clone my voice and image. And so, if you think about with politicians doing not just politicians, interest groups doing voter outreach and the like, right, getting voice cloning tools. I have a former student started this company called Civox. If you're interested, take a look at it. Sometimes I do a demo of it where it has a back and forth interaction from the candidate with the person on the telephone call, right? Now, when they do the right thing, which they announce at the beginning that it is an AI voice, right? Of course, like those robocalls that we saw in New Hampshire that were impersonating Biden, right? That was not the ethical use case, but all of these tools can be used for good or ill.
On that note, I'll just encourage everyone to not wire any money to anyone ever. Just don't do it. I want to ask.
We'll see if Georgetown Development agrees with that.
They accept check. It'll be fine. So I want to ask one more quick question, and then I'll open it up to the audience because we have such a great crowd here, and I'm sure you're chock full of questions. I'll let you guys choose. Do you want to give me a scary? You can one by one choose. You don't have to collectively choose because we don't have time for you to negotiate. Give me the best thing that you think we get from AI. We've talked about a lot of good things that we get from AI from a democratic perspective, or the scariest thing, the thing that keeps you up at night, the thing that you worry is going to happen as a result of AI related to democracy. Nate, you want to kick us off?
So I mentioned the AI panic problem. I actually don't think we're going to be able to solve that for various reasons. One thing I didn't talk about is why, like, image verification, like the kind of tools that we're trying to do to like validate when something is AI. I think that's kind of a fool's errand, even though we should invest in it because it's important. So I'm worried about the cybersecurity problems top of mind because they're potentially so ubiquitous. When the CrowdStrike flaw happened a few weeks ago and basically took down, airplane systems, all kinds of things, it wasn't necessarily an AI problem, right? It was just another incompetent software problem, though I'm sure there's AI involved in that. But it gives you a window as to what bad actors could do if empowered through AI. And like I said, that's a democracy problem, but it's much more than a democracy problem. It involves, the whole economy.
So I would say the best outcome for democracy related to AI that I can imagine is that we develop the ability to govern technology in our society, that it becomes so obvious that that is needed, that that there is attention paid to it by the government, by public sector actors, by civil society, by all of you, that there is a galvanizing moment where we finally get our arms around this and we have those conversations and make those decisions of the type that Nate referred to, where we decide as a society, as a polity, what we actually want, and that we work towards a version of AI governance that centers values of equity, of justice, of fairness, and opportunity, and that is really driven by the fact that AI is a part of our society, and we need to learn how to live with it in ways that are beneficial.
I will also follow the trend, and I guess negative, positive. I'll go back negative again.
Pressure's on, Laura.
I would say, I think there are a lot of very good, examples of things that are risky for elections. Rather than focusing on the nightmare scenario, which every time I have one of these conversations, someone draws my eye to a new one. I think for me, the most present risk that I'm looking at is that these tools spread misinformation and so people don't vote. There are a range of ways that you can evaluate whether or not something is a severe risk or not, but surely on the scale of things, someone not exercising their vote is a pretty severe ramification of AI's use. Now, whether that means that they saw a piece of disinformation that discouraged their behavior from going out to voting, or they saw something that scared them, like a video that shows that a bomb went off in a major metropolitan area so they don't leave their house that day thinking that they might not be safe, right? There are a range of ways that can happen, but maybe one of the less kind of news-grabbing is that someone could ask a chatbot, hey, where's my polling place? And or does my polling place have accessible options? If I show up, can I vote from my car? And they say, yeah, you can do that. And you get there, and there is not a way for you to vote from your car using curbside voting, for instance. Then that could, on election day, stop that individual from voting. And those individual stories of an individual going to the polling place and not being able to vote is something we're unlikely to ever find out about at a systemic level. And so the inability for us to kind of track down every instance of someone's vote being compromised by a tool where they got mis or disinformation scares me.
Well, Nate mentioned voice cloning, and so I would be remiss to not say that some of my students made a deep fake of my own voice, and apparently I was inviting you all to a new reality series called Dancing with DeNardis, so I appreciate that. But that doesn't keep me up at night. That was a lot of fun. What keeps me up at night, and this was the subject of my book, The Internet and Everything, Freedom and Security in a World with No Off Switch, which was about the Internet of Things. What keeps me up at night is that the Internet of Things the cyber physical world, all the things that you don't enter through a laptop. It's not about content, it's not about social media, it's not about scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. It's about the fact that everything, every object in our home is, many of the objects in our homes are connected, sensors that read the weather, traffic patterns, transportation. What does that have to do with the election? It has to do with the election because an overlay of AI on that, which makes some of these attacks I'm about to mention more sophisticated, let me put it this way. You don't have to break into voter rolls. You don't have to change the election results. You don't have to influence people. All you have to do is stop them from voting by exploiting the Internet of Things, creating false weather readings, false weather patterns. People don't vote as much when there's a bad weather forecast. You create a traffic jam. That's fairly easy to do. I'd be happy to talk about that with anyone afterwards. You could these are notoriously insecure things, like home alarm systems. You just grab a data scientist, there are many in this room, figure out where you need to stop people from voting in very, very small slivers of the United States, and then have their alarm systems go off or do something to distract them through the Internet of Things. And then they're not going to vote. They're dealing with law enforcement coming. Did someone break into my home? So you just distract, and you can use the Internet of Things to make phishing attacks more believable. So that's these kinds of concerns. We focus a lot on the social media and disinformation, but honestly, the much bigger threat is the cyber physical world and the fact that it is not as secure as the screen-based internet.
If I could just say one thing on the last two comments, and now I'm going to put on my hat that I used to wear as the research director of the President's Commission on Election Administration. One of the reasons early voting is important is to avoid some of these strategies that have been discussed, right? So that of the 160 million plus votes that will be cast in this election, the majority of them will be cast early. And they will be either by mail or through early voting centers and the like. And so that is actually an insurance mechanism against the kind of same-day election kind of interference that we're talking about here. And it also serves, as I was saying, like as an early warning system of problems if some of this is happening in the run-up. The election is basically a month long, right, at this point. North Carolina, they're going to mail out the ballots. There's some court action recently, but sometime in the next 2 weeks. And so this is a way, one of the good arguments, even though the early voting is controversial in many quarters here, but as you worry about interference through technology and otherwise, it's a way of building in some safeguards to make sure that doesn't happen. I'll say one thing that I am worried about that is related to this, which is a time-sensitive thing, is hacking of the election night reporting system. And so when we talk about technology and democracy, we think about often voting systems like the Dominion or voting machines that are actually, for reasons I can go into, I think very secure and not the conspiracy theories are wrong. But the election night supporting systems are websites. And if I'm right that the AI panic problem, and so the problem is chaos and loss of confidence, then all you need to do is start sort of messing with that to create the sense that someone was winning and then suddenly they're losing, and that can be done, just through the transfer of information between the precincts and the state election authorities. But that's really in the weeds, folks, as to how we measure
in a
elections.
two-finger to pile on to that important point. And you could also take out those sites by disrupting them by hijacking Internet of Things devices, which are insecure, to carry out a denial of service attack on those sites. So it's a very important point.
They're going to keep going back and forth unless somebody asks a question. So please, I think we have microphones to facilitate for the online crowd.
Hi, my name is Raghav. I'm an undergraduate here. Thank you so much for this panel. So earlier, you alluded that one of the best outcomes was if we learn to govern technology, we learn to govern AI. But you also alluded earlier to the recent Supreme Court decision that repealed the Chevron doctrine. So I'm wondering how much you think that those Supreme Court actions of restraining federal agencies' power to regulate will constrain our ability to realize the best possible scenario of learning to govern tech policy.
Great.
Great question.
Do you want to take that? You want me to?
I can start.
Okay.
So, yes. I think that the war on the administrative state is a real challenge in AI governance. It's certainly not the only challenge. There are a lot of other pieces in the way. But I think that, there's been a really strong focus on governing through the agencies, governing through executive action, et cetera. And part of what you're talking about there is why I think we really need to see governance in legislative action. That is one of the reasons, not the only reason.
So there are ways to get around the recent decisions to allow for somewhat broad delegations, but I think they would be politically impossible for various reasons. And so just so everyone's on the same page, right, the recent cases basically undermine the ability of agencies to interpret their own legislation that creates them, which had been a way of allowing for some nimbleness in the way that they would enforce over time. And so that hamstrings them. One of the challenges, though, if you were to try to write legislation right now dealing with AI, right, it's hard to write it with not knowing what the next 5 years of AI development are going to look like. And so just to give you an example, here's what happened in Europe. So the AI Act originally was focused on things like facial recognition and some of the discrimination stuff that I was talking about before. It did not include generative AI, okay? And then ChatGPT, the earthquake happens, right? And they kind of have to go back to the drawing board and patch together what was a risk-based framework in particular applications, and then throw on top of it these regulations of general purpose AI models, right? And so one of the challenges of doing the legislation, especially given how, I mean, all the other problems, I mean, Congress can't pass a budget, how are they going to regulate AI, is to have the foresight to regulate a technology that is moving so quickly, and then to predict what kind of authority is going to be necessary going forward. That's why I return to this kind of private ordering. If you get the auditing ecosystem right, then, which again is a heroic task, but let me be an academic for a second. If you were able to, that is a way of at least forcing the companies to remain true to their promises as to the risks of the products that they are developing, and to develop outsiders who will then evaluate those ongoing promises about how the technology is going to operate.
Putting full power in the microphone distributors. So.
Hi, my name is John. I used to work with the Wilson Center. They have a program there where they make games, and one of the games they were making was about deepfakes. As part of my research for that, I made a document that's about 11 pages long about positive uses of deepfakes. So I'm a person that thinks that there are really good uses for it, but I understand a lot of people don't think that way. Do you think regulation is aiming more towards the freedom of speech sort of angle, or do you think it's more leaning towards protection of elections and that sort of thing? And what's your opinion about it? Which way would you rather see it align? Thank you.
Sure, I'll start. I think there's a big difference between our asks of companies and what government can and should require of companies. I think it is incumbent to pressure in any, I think, democratic society the kind of for-profit organizations to do their best to try not to harm democracy. And so I think along those lines, there are a large number of things that we should be recommending that these companies put in place in order to create a kind of comprehensive election integrity project, that means things like usage policies prohibiting the development or the kind of distribution of deepfakes, but in addition to those things, then also having good labeling programs, and obviously doing things like watermarking AI content so that users can see it. I think there are questions about the utility of those things and actually giving users enough information to ensure that they're getting good information, and there's still outstanding, I think, questions about whether or not watermarking actually increases people's trust in the content itself, whether or not they're aware of its authenticity, that I think need to be studied more. But so I think that there are a lot of things that we should be pressuring companies to do in terms of their usage policies, their enforcement, their detection of these sorts of things. But that's very different from, I think, what we can require that these companies do through government regulation. To your point, the First Amendment protects a lot of political free speech and should, right? I think everyone here would agree that protecting that sort of speech is very important, and that's just a kind of a restriction that we have to be careful about. In terms of what that means for legislation, CDT does support legislation that would require disclosure of when AI is deceptively being used in advertisements, but I don't think that we would go as far as to support banning the distribution or use of a deepfake online. So I think a regulatory regime that moves towards a transparency kind of perspective, I think, is something that we would support. But I think everyone kind of has a different perspective here.
No, well, look, you're not going to be able to ban AI produced content. I mean, that's like banning Marvel movies, right? I mean, that AI is part of the entertainment industry, right? It's all these kinds of things. But let me also say that regulation is inevitable, and the question is where it comes from. And I don't just mean legislation like at the state or the federal level or Europe or where international organizations. Defamation law is a regulation on AI, okay? So that if you use deep fakes in order to put someone in a false light intentionally, right, there's cause of action. Similarly, we're gonna have to solve the intellectual property problems with AI, right? That's like, no regulation is not an option. We're gonna need answers, whether they're provided by courts or provided by legislatures, as to what the rules are about whether, OpenAI is allowed to hoover up all your data and then, all your creativity and then develop models off of it, right? So there's going to be answers that come from it. Most of the time when we think about regulation of deepfakes, it's in the context of this disclosure or the malicious use of deepfakes in order to injure someone's reputation, which then would be a species of defamation.
My name is Jaden. I'm a sophomore studying computer science, society and ethics here at Georgetown, and hopefully one day I'd like to go to law school. So my question actually relates to kind of the legal implications of AI. So obviously we're well aware of companies that are creating their own versions of AI kind of marketed to their specific users. And my specific example is Apple. They just came out with the new iPhone 16 today that is going to be the first phone from their lineup to provide AI kind of built in, like their own, I guess, Apple Intelligence is what they're calling it, their own version of that. And Apple is known to be a company that has a lot of privacy policies and is actually probably the #1 company when it comes to privacy and the privacy of its users. But my question kind of relates to, are we allowed to put that trust in these specific companies like Apple? And if not, what are some ways that people like myself who want to go to law school and our politicians creating policies to help with this, what are some ways that they can create some laws that will help with the privacy of AI as it relates to the legal system? Thank you.
Thanks for that question, and thanks for being a CS Ethics and Society major. That's a wonderful thing if people don't know about it. There's also a minor in Tech Ethics and Society, and it's growing really quickly. It's doubled in the last year, and if you're a Georgetown student, please come talk to me about both of those things. The way I would answer this is by looking to other areas of multi-stakeholder governance. Like it's really, there's been a lot said about regulation, but a lot of the power of this involves design itself and standard setting itself. Like, you can't just regulate a technology once it's developed. I would say that a lot of the solutions exist in some of the work that's being done in the technical standard setting organizations, and you well know that as a CS major, to shore up the privacy, to use strong encryption, to do privacy by design. It also involves the companies themselves, and we don't want to only put our faith in the companies, but that it's important to acknowledge that this is a private sector, multi-stakeholder environment where you have regulation, you have design, the technical communities, you have new institutions that carry out various kinds of administrative coordination, like digital certificate, authentication, and public key cryptography, and that a lot of the solution, it's a multi-stakeholder problem and has to have multi-stakeholder solutions. And I think that example you gave is a good one, because we don't want to put our trust in the company. We want to put our trust in a multi-stakeholder environment that involves that combination of the role of regulation, the role of design, the role of these new coordinating institutions, and the private sector. I would add, though, that the private sector includes not only here, let me say it this way, all companies are tech companies, not just Apple. And all companies are using AI, and they are very concerned about liability and reputational harm that could befall them by using these technologies. And they are pursuing things like cyber liability insurance. And by the time you get over the hurdle of getting insurance, this is just one little example, you've raised your security up to a point, and I think the same thing could be done in AI, where it has to do with corporate governance. And I give a lot of talks to people who are on boards, and believe me, they're really, really concerned about this and about their liability exposure.
I'll just say I agree with all of that, and I think the multi-stakeholder approach is critical. It is also true that in the United States, we do not have a comprehensive federal Data Privacy Protection Act, and that we are an outlier in the world because of that. And because of that kind of oversight and legislation has moved to the state level, which means that we have this patchwork of protections, which is not a great way to govern. So if you are going to become a lawyer and want to go out and write legislation and pass bills, that's a great one. That's a great one to focus on.
We're counting on all of you to fix all of these things. Please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the panel and answering all of our questions regarding AI. My name is Trey. I'm a first-year graduate student with the Data Science and Analytics program. A lot of this panel talked about a variety of different topics. Mr. DeNardis, you talked about cybersecurity abroad. Mr. Harper, you talked about misinformation. Ms. Haven, you talked about particularly the governmental power structures that are created with the tension on governance of AI. And Mr. Persily, you talked about the lens of how we should view the solutions on such a thing that creates societal harm. My question stems from kind of all of these topics combined, because a lot of these views are not shared on a broader scale beyond borders. So given the UN's regulations on AI, both recently and in the prior decade, can you weigh in based on your personal judgment on how current regulations as well as regulations to come in individual countries, either net positive or net negative, will impact international relations, geopolitics, and democracy specifically abroad?
Let's get you a chair. Let's get you a chair and put you up there. That was a great summary. I'll just make one quick comment. What happens locally affects something around the other side of the world. So, like the GDPR affects companies in the US if they do business in the European Union. A leak in, let's say, Border Gateway Protocol in Pakistan can make Google or YouTube be inaccessible around the world. Like, what happens globally affects the local, what happens locally affects the global, and there's a huge geopolitics in that. The one comment that I would make, and you may know this already, is that everything is coming up multilateral in the international discussions. And in the United Nations, you would expect something like that. But in a lot of the I'm a global technology governance scholar. A lot of the discussions are moving from this multi-stakeholder environment, as problematic as it is, into multilateral discussions. And I don't think that's going to solve the problems that were discussed here. But thank you for bringing the geopolitics into this.
Great question. I sort of ran out of time, but I usually say there are two big questions. One is the open source question, and one is China. And we kind of didn't talk about that because the geopolitical questions are also democracy questions, right? So that if authoritarian governments end up getting the lead in the development of the technology, that is a democracy problem as well. Now, this is, by articulating this, the China boogeyman is often, in Silicon Valley, ubiquitous. Whenever we talk about technology, oh, well, you can't regulate technology because of this. One of the reasons I keep talking about auditing and transparency is because I think that's a way of fostering the development of the technology without necessarily abdicating the development there. But if there is going to be AGI or significant progress toward the development of this technology, it's critical that it be done in democratic countries. We still have a significant edge in the United States. Pretty much no other country in the world. I mean, you've got significant efforts in the Middle East and certainly in Europe, but nothing that's comparable to what we're seeing in the U.S. And I think we actually need that. And the hard part is you cannot have any multilateral agreement, let alone verifiable agreement, unless China is part of that, right? And so there is, significant innovation that's of course happening in China, and unless we deal with that aspect of the issue, you're like not dealing with the problem.
Hi, my name is Yuki. I'm a junior studying in the SFS. So we kind of talked about how AI proliferation and increased exposure to social medias has kind of depoliticized the public and even confused the public to a point that it has led to a reflex of questioning of virtually anything, even though that the content is true. So my question is, how to improve, or what are some of the ways to improve people's performance on identifying what is true, or is that hardly possible to achieve, given that nothing or no news can essentially capture the reality 100%? Thank you.
Oh, I don't get to answer questions.
Yeah. No?
No, you should answer.
I'll take a stab.
No, Tim, please.
So it's a really important question, right? Which is, we oftentimes refer to this as the liar's dividend, is kind of the shorthand for this, but it's really just, as Nate had kind of explained earlier, it is the situation where as people become more aware that things could be hard to detect, that they're untruthful, people's trust in true information also goes down. Some of the ways that this could be employed is that a candidate could say that a fake video of themselves, or that a true video of themselves doing something that is a scandal or something illegal is actually a fake video. There's a lot of ways in which this could end up being questions in the legal system. If someone makes the claim that a video of them committing a crime is actually a deep fake of them and that they didn't do that, right, and there was no other video, there was no other evidence other than this video, right, all of this is still to be decided, I think, a lot of ways. That said, how you go about increasing people's trust in a world where trust is declining, I think, is a society-wide problem that needs to not only just be about how we increase trust in elections, but how we increase people's trust in true information. And there's a wide basis of ways in which this work is being done, but I think some of them are first is, it's important to invest in getting out truthful information. So that can mean tech platforms boosting authoritative information from election officials. That means ensuring that people have access to unbiased fact-checking information, resources that they can go to where they trust that the information is true, that they're not associating those things increasingly with one political party over the other. And in addition to those things, kind of building people's individual resilience is a major focus before this election. So there's a lot of public information campaigns that are going out on the airwaves telling people that they should anticipate that they might get text messages from their family members telling them to send them information or money, right? There's telling people that if they see skeptical looking information that pulls on, especially on their emotions, fear and happiness, that they should be skeptical of that information, that they should make sure that they're looking out for fake emails that could be trying to get them to, like phishing campaigns, right? Those sorts of things I think are really important, but they are only a part of the puzzle. And the other piece is that media literacy and confidence in true facts, I think, is a really important thing that needs to be expanded kind of across the board, from civil society, from government service, and agencies, and then also from the media.
Well, let me just say, right, the more that we say, be careful what's out there. A lot of it's fake. The more that we feed into the panic that I was talking about before. Also, let me say something that I think might be controversial in this room. Most of what we call disinformation is technically not false. All right, and that's not a political statement about like bias and fact checkers and things like that, though there's a discussion to have about that. It's that most of the things that are creating false beliefs in people's minds are not necessarily remedied by a lie detector on the internet. It's exaggeration, it's polarized content, it's propaganda, right? And so even if we were able to chop off all of the false content, we're not going to solve what is oftentimes seen as the disinformation problem. And the AI hook to this, if you look at the AI, it's really, there's been quite an explosion in the last 2 weeks of synthetic video content of the presidential candidates. I don't know if you've seen the ones where, now there's one where, because of this stuff about cats, have you seen these videos with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump petting these cats? And then there was this video about, putting them all in like 7-Elevens with guns, like they were robbing them. It's like no one really believes that a lot of that is true, but a lot of it is trying to feed into other narratives, polarizing narratives, so it kind of persuades people. And so much of we tend to think that when voters look at content, that they are processing it in a kind of Lincoln Douglas debate fashion, where they're weighing the kind of truth and falsity of it, and then they come to a conclusion. But so much of it is appealing to emotion and to tribalism, and then it piggybacks onto all the other kind of biases and impulses that people have. And so it's very difficult, for instance, in this environment, to then distinguish between political content and entertainment, as an example.
So on that cheery note, we have to wrap up. Thank you so much for your attendance, for your questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists as well.